It's going to be a very short segment. It's just something I need you to pay very close attention to. You ready? Like and subscribe below. That's it. Let's go back to the project. Now, the first thing you need when you're working on a Traxxas Rustler is a Traxxas Rustler. Would you look at that? Would you just look at it? Would you look at that? Would you look at this? What the heck is that? Okay, but for real now, there is some things you need to know. It comes with stickers. They add 5 horsepower. It comes with a box with great box art. All you need is a Phillips screwdriver. Then why do I have all of these? Alright guys, so sadly I do not have the video up in time. I plan on having it up Friday night. Unfortunately, I realized I did everything that I was going to do and completely forgot to hit the record button. So, all things aside, I can still show you what we're going to do. There's one thing I forgot to do, so we'll be able to get to that tonight as well. And I will go through one of the steps that I already did. I will actually redo it so that you can learn the way to rebuild shocks the way that I do, which is kind of just a classic general way of doing it. But we'll go through the other things that I did to the Rustler so that you can make it handle better than it does from the factory in the box. You guys who have a Traxxas Slash, you're going to basically do this exact same thing, just a slight variation. With the Slash, I usually go down 2.5 weight on the shock fluid just because the narrow suspension reacts a little differently. So on the Rustlers, you can usually use a little bit heavier weight shock fluid and get the same kind of reaction because of the longer suspension arms. So here we go. Let's get into it. As per usual, you've got your typical Traxxas Rustler. You're going to go ahead and take the body clips off of it, and you'll be able to see right away a couple of the things that I've done to it to increase the handling. First off, you will notice that the waterproof box is gone and a Futaba R204 GFE antennaless receiver is installed. That is personal preference. I use a Futaba 4PV, so I do not need the Traxxas receiver in here with the big long antenna. I also don't need the waterproof box because I never drive my vehicles in the water or in the rain or anything like that. Another thing that I did is I removed the XL5 speed controller from the top mount position. I used side cutters to clip the screw wings off and then mounted it to the side. That lowers the center of gravity substantially, so that's another thing that I did. One thing that I will show you on the rear shocks. From the factory, they put that in this eyelet. I move it to the outside. This again widens the rear shock stance. It actually will lay them down more. This will give you more side-to-side traction. So that is a couple of the things that I did. Now let's get into the actual work. So first things first, I'm going to rebuild one front shock, and then I will talk about what I did with the rest. So top screw and bottom screw, the whole shock will come off. So we'll get back to that in just a moment. Alright, so we've got the shock off. One thing I will say is nice about Traxxas is a Phillips. It's nice and it's not nice because it's so easy to strip the Phillips screws. So one thing that I do suggest is, and this is something that's outside of the $10 upgrade, but go ahead and check out STRC. They make a screw kit for the Slash, and so does RC Screws. And I believe K&K also makes a set for the Slash and the Rustler now. And you can replace all of the steel Phillips head screwdriver screws with stainless steel, I believe in even oxide coated screws that are hex head, so you can use your normal hex head drivers that do not strip out nearly as bad. That being said, let's get to the shock. First thing you want to do when redoing the shock is you want to have some paper towel handy, and you'll want to make it roughly 3 or 4, maybe even 5 ply thick, depending on how many shocks you're redoing at one time. And really that's about it. So let's look down at the bench. Since this is a front shock, we'll be using some 30 weight shock fluid. Now for those of you who are not familiar with the associated shock fluid, or if you use just your main CST weight in general, or if you're in the UK where they don't use weights, they use CSTs all the time, this is a 350 CST shock fluid. So on these, you're just going to hold it like so, compress the spring, push the spring cup off, set it aside, pull the spring off, pull the spring collar off, and then you have just your shock without the spring. Hold tight, grab the top, twist, pull the cap off, set it aside. This one you want to be careful with. This is the bladder, so be careful not to tear it. If you have thumbnails or anything like that, be very careful, but you want to have that off and dry. So pull it to the side, then take your shock, dump it upside down, compress it. Do that a couple times, make sure it's cleaned out. So I just, like I said, I just built these yesterday and I completely screwed up and forgot to hit the record button. So I'm just unfortunately giving you guys more of a quick update on how to do this. So let's get back to the shock. So go ahead and we're going to fill now. Now one thing that I do on bladder shocks is I make sure to not fill all the way up to the top, because you don't need that anyway, and that's probably still too much. Now you're going to push the piston up until it's almost to the top, but not breaking the surface. Now the reason you don't want to break the surface with that E-clip that is on the top of that piston is if you do, it will pull air bubbles into it, and you want that to actually suck down underneath the piston, so you move real slow so that it moves underneath the piston, and then you have a nice clean track without any air bubbles right away, so you don't have to sit there and let it sit in a stand and let it bleed all the bubbles out of it on its own. So that is about where that should be at. I might actually have a little bit much in there. I'm going to say it is. And it is. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and use my bladder as a scoop for a couple drops here, just to get that pulled off. And now it's back pretty well where it needs to be. There's still a little excess, so let's just go ahead and use that bladder some more. Now you want to be careful doing this though, because if you do that too many times, if the heat from your hand will actually cause the bladder to expand, as this bladder is actually attempting to do, and then it will not seat properly in the top of the shock. Now once you have that back in the top of the shock, you take your shock cap, wiggle it over the bladder a little bit, try not to get the bladder curled underneath of it, and try not to get the cap itself cross-threaded, which is probably the hardest part. Then once you're about 2 to 3 threads away from the full seat, like that, go ahead and slowly push that piston up to the top, and then tighten it down. Now you notice there'll be a little bit of fluid that comes out. What that does is it bleeds out the excess fluid that you don't need in there. So then we'll go ahead and dry it up. And then there's only a little bit of air in there, which you should have a little bit of air in bladder shocks because you're hearing the air more move on the top than on the bottom. So I always give it 40 pumps. So give or take, that was 40. Now it should be a slight rebound, which it is. As you can tell, it's moving up. You can't because it was not in the camera. So it should at that point be a slight rebound. As you can see, it's moving out very slowly. So that is where I like to have my Traxxas shocks, is at a slight rebound. On my race cars, I usually try to get a 0 rebound, but that's a little different. So then we're going to put our collar back on, our spring back on, compress the spring, slide the cup back on, pull it down onto the eyelet, and then our shock is rebuilt. And you're going to do that on all 4 shocks. I use 30 weight or 350 CST on the front, and on the rear I used a 32.5 weight, which is a 388 CST. So try to get somewhere in that standardized area for a good overall base point for your Rustler or Slash. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is actually work on the rear differential. Once we get in here, we're going to pull this all out, and I'm going to show you what I did to the rear links as well. So we're going to pull the motor off, the cover off, and we're going to get inside to the rear differential. Alright guys, so one thing that I did mean to mention on this that I almost forgot is on the front shocks, go ahead and put those on the outer hole of the 2 as well. If you get the RPM arms and you're putting those on, use the outer of the 3 holes. Do not use the far out hole, as that is a spot for a Proline sway bar to attach. So you do not need to use the far out hole if you're using the RPM front arms. That is all in the front shocks. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the rear end now. So I'm going to go ahead and move the camera back down to lower position so you can see what all I do on the rear ends. First thing I'll be doing is taking off the wheels and tires. Then I'll be taking off the dust cover for the spur and pinion gear, and then taking the motor out, and then I'll be able to show you what I did with the rear links. So to take the rear wheels off, you'll need a 7mm nut driver, and then to get inside the rear end, you will need the Phillips screwdriver, as usual with the rest of the vehicle. Now at this point, if you're like me and you pick the vehicle up used, one thing that you want to go ahead and do is grab a flathead screwdriver of some form and then put it inside. Make sure that when there's a pin inside here, make sure that that pin is in a parallel position with your tabletop. Put the flathead screwdriver in there and then twist it, and that will unsnap that hex, and you can slide it off, and you can be able to get any hair or debris that may be wrapped around the axle by the bushing or bearing, depending on which model you have. This particular model is a bushing model, as it is the lesser expensive one. As again, I purchased this used, so it did have some in it that I did end up taking off, and then these have a hard snap, but they do snap back on. So now, one thing I'm going to do is get into the rear gearbox here. There's a screw on the top right here, and there's a screw directly underneath in the bottom. Let me rotate this around so that you can see. There's a screw here that you'll have to take off, and a screw here that you have to take off, and that will remove the dust cover. Alright, now that we have our screws removed, we can go ahead and remove the dust cover. Just give it a little wiggle and it'll pop right off. Now you can see your pinion gear and your spur gear and slipper clutch assembly. The slipper clutch on the Traxxas you cannot really see, as the slipper pads and plates are behind this covered spur gear, which is just a vented style instead of being an open style like most of your race vehicles. So let's go ahead and get this off, and I'll show you on that. Now, one thing you'll need to do to get this off is you'll need your 7mm wrench like you use on your wheels. You will also need 2 small drivers, such as these. Now these drivers you're going to take, and you're going to find where what is called the wishbone or dog bone is at in here, and you're going to jam it down in between there. And you're going to do that on both sides. Now the reason being is because with an open differential, if you turn the spur gear, it will rotate the drive shafts. So you need to put these down in there to keep the drive shaft from rotating so that you can take that nut off. Then at that point you can take these out and set them aside for reassembly. Take the spring off. Once you get that nut and spring off, you'll notice that there's bearings inside the spur gear. Go ahead and carefully pull that off so that you do not lose the slipper pads that look like brick shoes on the inside. Then pull off this assembly and plate. and then pull this pin out without dropping it down inside your transmission. That pin right there. And then you'll have this rear assembly done to where you can then pull the motor out as well. You can pull the motor out first. It's just 2 screws. Again, Phillips head screws. Also, one thing to do to just help make things a little easier is go ahead and set your screws in the order which they came out across the top of your workbench. That is actually what I'm doing up on this plane right here. I've got an extra shelf here that I'm using so that it's not in the way of the vehicle. So then set your screws aside for the motor, which are these large screws as well. And then these here just are a hard pull and unsnap from each other, just as so. Then you can take your motor and set it aside as well. I tend to set it in a separate position so that it does not attract any of the screws. So then we're going to go ahead and move our motor wires aside and just go ahead and put them up front. Because in order to get the rear differential off, we'll also need to remove the 2 rear screws from the shock tower. There are 4 screws in the shock tower. There are 2 back here and 2 up here. We need these 2 rear ones removed. Now, one thing that I will show you that I did is these links. You have to do this in order to move the links. What I'm about to do, you do not have to do inside the transmission, but it's recommended. But on these links, I went ahead and raised them. They're usually on the lower screw hole. I moved them up to a higher screw hole. When you raise the inner link, it actually changes the roll center of the vehicle to a lower roll center versus a higher roll center. So that will give you more side-to-side traction as well. And one thing I'll do just to make this easier is I'm going to go ahead and take off the top screws of the rear shocks just to make it easier to disassemble the rear end. That way it does not need any more fight or tension. The last thing you want to do is make your job harder. And one thing that I did notice when I redid these is these rear shocks do have a slight bend in them, so I will have to eventually replace these rear shocks with a new set of Ultra shocks. One thing I'll be doing when I do that as well is replacing the shock caps with aluminum ones. It's just a personal preference. You don't have to do that, but as a personal preference, I've noticed in the past that I tend to pop the shock caps off when I'm driving off-road or under heavy corner conditions, just with these plastic shock caps on a plastic shock body. It's just 2 points of flex versus putting an aluminum cap on. It only gives you 1 point of flex, which is the body itself, and they tend not to pop off the top and get oil all over your cars at that point. One thing I will say, like I said, the shock fluid weights on here I did, and I put no spring spacers in the rear and none in the front. If you're running oval, if you're doing this to a Slash and you're running oval, it's going to be totally different. Find out what your track runs, because what your track runs is what you're going to need to do. You'll have different spacers, you'll have different fluids in each shock. Around here, B-Mod is a very popular class, which is taking a stock Slash, putting a modified body on it, and that's what you do with that. One thing that we'll talk about in just a moment is what I'm going to do to the rear differential. If you're running oval, you want the rear end to be very loose, and the guys who are fast typically take all grease out and they put powdered graphite inside the rear differential. We'll get to that in just a moment, but I just wanted to give you a heads up before we get there. Alright, now that we have those 2 screws out of the shocks, we need to flip the vehicle over and get the screws out of the bottom. So in order to remove the rear end, we need to remove all 6 of these screws here. Now at this point, I would typically not remove any other screws. However, for sake of ease, I'm going to take the two out of here so that I can show you just the rear end without it being connected to the vehicle anymore. Okay, now one thing that you will read in the Traxxas manual is about something called a shoulder screw at many points. This is what's called a shoulder screw. It is threaded, but it has this up here that's called a shoulder. And that is what you'll be reading about. Now that we've got all that done, I should technically be able to loosen these here front shock screws and go ahead and pull the rear end completely off. You may have to bend the chassis a little bit, as there is a couple of spots right here that hold that rear end in place. Okay, so now that we've got our rear end on the table, we can go ahead and remove the screws on the side to pull it off. Now one thing that you will have to do is you will have to remove your inner drive links for the rear axles. In order to do that, you need a 1.5 millimeter driver such as this one from Sticky Kicks Racing. Now once those are pulled off, you'll be able to go ahead and actually just set those half shafts aside. They just slide into the outer one, so they're easy to move. Now we can get in to all these screws here. For this, I'm going to use my screw gun. All of those screws are loosened. You'll be able to grab this casing and just lightly and gently pull it apart. One thing I'm going to do before I do that is put some paper towel underneath of it, just in case there's any debris or grease inside that may want to come out. You may have a few screws that are still trying to attach. You can go ahead and work on those as well. Make sure that everything is loosened. Oh yes, this is one thing I forgot. From the factory there is a tape seal across the bottom with just black electrical tape. That does need to be removed in order to access the rear differential. And once you get inside here, you'll have a top, mid, and lower gears. I will usually go ahead and pull these out and give them a good once over and make sure there's no pieces of metal, debris, or anything like that in there, and put them back in. Same with the middle idler gear. Make sure there's no debris, and then place them back inside. This one looks pretty good. Now inside of this, there's several gears. So we're going to get inside of here, and that'll be able to show you what we're going to be changing. For this, you'll need a very small Phillips screwdriver to remove these 4 screws. Once these 4 screws are removed, you're able to then pull the gears apart. Be careful not to lose any of the very small gears that are inside. Give me just one moment. I'll be back with some fluid for the inside of the gear. Before we open the gear, I'm going to go ahead and go over what you can put inside the gear. Now, as I said before, there are a few different things. One thing that you can do with the rear differential is you can put dry graphite powder in it, which will make it a free open diff. You can put the black grease back in it that it comes with, which will make it a little tighter, so it won't have quite as much differential action, which is opposite rotation, allowing one tire to turn faster than the other upon cornering and getting more friction on one side or the other. Some people, and I've done this myself, has put a little bit of lightweight shock fluid inside of it. Don't ever really go past 27.5. They're technically sealed, but they're not greatly sealed. So they're not one that you'd want to do too much of this in at all. So it's not like a sealed diff on a race car or something like that. Again, you can put the black grease back in it. Sticky Kicks, again, has these in these great syringes to where they're easy to place. One thing that I prefer And I like this because it's kind of like the middle point between the shock fluid and the dry graphite. I really like a free rear differential, so I actually put ball differential grease inside of my ready-to-run vehicle's gearbox. It does well with the heat, it holds up to the heat, it's just a little bit thinner, so it frees a little bit more than the black grease does, and but it lasts longer and doesn't leak out like the silicone shock fluid does. So that is what I'm going to be putting in, is just a couple of drops of the clear Sticky Kicks ball diff grease. Okay, so let's go ahead and crack this open and see what we're actually working with here. If you notice, when you go to pull it apart, all these pieces and parts come out. So these set on these little shafts like so. But look at all that grease that's in there. This is that real thick black grease. We want to get that out. The best way to do that is just with a plain old paper towel, reaching down in there and kind of digging at it and getting it out. Now these are what are called internal planetary gears. Now, even though this is not a super effective way of cleaning, you can see that it gets, for the most part, it gets it pretty well cleaned out. One thing that you can do that will actually help as well is if you have the ability, or if you've already got nitro cars laying around, use some nitro clean on the inside of here, but then quickly rinse it out with water so that you don't deteriorate the Delrin that the gearbox is actually made out of. Once you get it, for the most part, cleaned out, what we'll then do is take some of our syringe of our clear fluid, which I apparently put on very tight the last time I used it. And go ahead and just put a little bit down inside there. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and drop this across. And that will show you how those gears move. So that's how those gears move. Now let's go ahead and put some fluid inside. Not a lot, just enough to fill in the grooves. And we're going to go ahead and give it some rotation just to get that seated through and make sure that it's doing well. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more over here and then a little bit more down there. And then I'm going to put this side on there and rotate it just to make sure that everything is moving functionally the way that it is supposed to. And it looks like it is. So we're going to go ahead and put this back together and call it a day. At least a day on the differential. Now, one thing I do want to stop and say, when you're putting this back together, make sure you're doing across, not one side then the other, because you want to make sure that that seats down well. And you also want to make sure you don't over tighten this and pinch the gears inside. So you just want to get them to where they're snug and then call it good. And this is the reason that I'm hand tightening these and nothing else. You notice we don't really have a whole lot of grease left on this gear. So what we'll do is I'll put some of that black grease on these gears, which will just help with the rotation and keep the heat down inside of the transmission housing. Now, one thing we do want to make sure is make sure that it rotates correctly. And it's good. So we're good. Now, if you notice, that's not really seating well on there. It's all on one side. So that's when I'll go ahead and just kind of brush it over and just add just a little bit more for good measure. And that'll be all the black grease that I put on there. Once it's all back together, just make sure that your gears rotate freely so that you didn't get the case too tight. Once that's successfully done, we're good to go to put the rear drive shaft, half shafts back on. So let's go ahead and clean this area up a little bit and then start working on the rear half shafts. Then the rear half shafts go back on just the way they came off. Rotate it until it slides in. Slide it on. And you're going to do that on both sides. And I will sometimes see if I can reuse this, and if it will go back on, then I'll just reuse it. If not, it's perfectly fine. It doesn't need to be on there. All it is just a dirt guard to help keep some dirt in there, mainly if you're running in water or heavy debris. So now our rear end is ready to be reassembled. Okay, now our rear end is almost ready to be put back together. Now one thing that I'm going to do before I actually get the rear end on is I'm going to put in the speed kit. This is a smaller tooth, factory one, the 90 tooth spur. This is an 86 tooth spur. Smaller on the spur, more top speed. It's also a larger tooth pinion. Higher tooth on the pinion, more top speed. So we're going to go ahead and put this in and convert it over to that, because I'm going to be running lipos in it, so I want the speed. I know what you're thinking, like, Jordan, I thought this was a $10 thing. It is. This is all labor. You should have tools already. If not, the kit comes with some. And you should have a Phillips screwdriver laying around your house. The $10 I'm referring to is a bottle of shock fluid. These are usually $6. You can get them as low as $5. So if you were running 30 in the front and 32.5 in the rear, or if you're running 27.5 in the front and 30 in the rear, you should be able to, for $10, get 2 bottles of shock fluid. The rest of it is just a matter of time, labor, and a little bit of know-how. So we're going to go ahead and set the vehicle aside again after I put this last screw in. See, even seasoned people forget screws sometimes. Now our rear end is finished. And that. So in order to swap over to the higher speed pinion, we need to get the bearing out. We need to get the slipper plates off. Now the slipper plates are done with a 2.5mm wrench. So reach for your 2.5mm wrench. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get a small flathead. Actually, I might be able to just use this one here. You're just going to pop at that a little bit until it comes up out of there, because these actually sit down in those screw holes. And then this will just pop right out the middle once that's out. So then this you can just go ahead and set aside and use for a future date. Now this here, you just need to line up these 3 points with these 3 holes and put your screws back in. If for some reason at some point in time you notice that your acceleration is weird, no matter how tight you tighten the nut that goes on the spring onto the slipper pinion or slipper spur setup, if you notice that it's just squealing, you may want to go ahead and pull this off and check and see what kind of wear the pads on the slipper have. So these are a semi-metallic pad, just like a brake pad is, and these will wear down over time as they're rotating on this plate, which acts as essentially a brake rotor. However, this is going between your trigger finger and the driveline of the vehicle, and what that does is it allows it to have a little bit of slip before it goes, so that it doesn't give you full snap on the transmission, which can cause damage to the internal components of the transmission. So it's just a beneficial thing. Also, if you're on dirt, it helps with corner exit speed and things like that. So now that that's done, go ahead and show the other important part, which is the pinion gear and the set screw for the pinion gear. Now one thing you want to make sure that you do every time is on the pinion set screw, go ahead and get it on your driver, and we're going to put some thread lock on this. I personally use TLR lock. I'm not really a TLR fan, but the TLR lock is the fastest setting thread lock that I have found yet, and I'm an impatient person, so I don't like to wait. And all you need is just one drop, just one little drop on there, just like that. And then go ahead and start that on there. Just make sure that when you're looking down the hole, it is not actually coming through, so that you can go ahead and get that on the motor shaft in just a moment. You have about 10 to 15 minutes of time to work with it before it actually sets, so it's a good thing to do on that. So on this one, you're going to want to go ahead and just grab your motor, grab your 1.5, twist it, and slide it off. Now you'll notice on the motor, there is a flat spot on one side. I don't know if you can see that in the video or not, but there is a flat spot on this side. In that flat spot, there's a little dot where that set screw is at. So it kind of gives you a rough idea of where the new pinion gear needs to be. So at this point, we need to go ahead and get the Rustler back up on here. And if you notice inside this, there's that little black circle. This only works with the factory setup of pinion and spur. So you're going to want to go ahead and pop that out, just like that. As it falls to the ground, you can pick it up, and you notice it has a little gizmo in there that kind of holds it in place. That way it's really easy to install the motor and not have to really worry about gear mesh. We're going to have to set gear mesh this time. So to go ahead and do this, we're going to grab our needle nose and grab our small pin. We're going to slide that small pin back into its hole, like so. And make sure that this, with its line, lines up with that pin. And then we're going to grab the pinion, or I'm sorry, the spur gear and slipper assembly, slide it on as well. Grab the spring and the nut, and we're going to spin those on until they start to move at that point. That is when we need to go ahead and do our trick we did earlier with the two drivers, with putting them in here to keep from getting rotation, and then using our nut driver wherever it may have disappeared to, then using our nut driver to actually tighten that on. The happy medium, or the happy spot I found on a Slash vehicle, is to go flush with the top shaft and then go in 2 turns. So I will go in to where the nut is flush with the top shaft and then go in another 2 turns, and that's usually where I like my tension at. Okay, so now that that's done, we can go ahead and install the motor. If you notice, I'm going to install it this time without the pinion on it because I need to do that once the motor is actually in and the screws are in place. So you need to have these 2 screws kind of tilted forward towards the vehicle. But the great thing about Traxxas compared to like your race kits and stuff like that is they are actually incredibly easy to work on. Everything that I'm showing you here today is how you would replace just about any major part. The only thing I'm not getting into is the front section where the steering servo is at. At one point I'll replace the steering servo, and then I will show you how to do that as well. So now that we've got our motor back on, as you can see, it's there. I'm going to go ahead and loosen these back up just a hair. And what that will do is it will give me a little bit of motor movement. That way I can put this new pinion gear on and set the motor mesh. So we'll make sure that's good and tight. And then you want that to be as much gear-to-gear contact as possible, so you don't want to have that pinion too far forward or too far back. Because too far back, it's going to actually rub on the case and cause a bunch of friction and burn your motor up a lot faster. And since this is a brush motor, it's going to go out on its own anyway because the brushes wear down, and I don't want to have to spend 25 bucks for a new motor within the next couple of days. So you want to make sure that that is not touching the case so that you get good amount of motion. The next thing is setting gear mesh. So to set gear mesh, we're going to go ahead and get the top screw a little bit tighter, just enough to where I can still move the motor like that, but to where I know where it's at. And then you want to get it to where you're not fully engaged, but there's just a slight bit of tap. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can see that in the video. There's just a slight bit of motion there. That slight bit of motion is what will give you the greatest, not only ability in the gears itself, so there's still that slight bit of motion. It'll give you the greatest cooling, it'll give you the greatest power, and Now I'm just snugging them up to make sure they don't move. And it will help it run as it should without stripping gears. That's the other thing. You also, if you have the gears all the way connected to each other, they will actually end up chewing each other up. So that's why you want to make sure that there's a little bit of space for play. Our rear end is ready for the wheels to go back on. Not quite, actually. First we need to put our dust cover back on. So dust cover, this rubber grommet goes to the top. This rubber grommet does pop out, and that is where you can actually get to the slipper adjustment without pulling this cover off. And in case you're wondering, if you're wanting to use the same tools that I'm using, it is the Sticky Kicks RC Pro set. And then the fluid that I used inside of the transmission is the Sticky Kicks RC white ball differential grease. I believe it's around $10 a tube. I have to look on the website again. Maybe a little less than that, actually. It's fantastic stuff, though. If you're a racer and you're just watching this video just for general information, go ahead and pick some of that up, because if you're running two-wheel drive mod buggy, it is the only white grease I've ever used in a ball diff that does not break down and become just like a fluid by the end of a season. It will stay the same consistency the entire season long, and I have been thoroughly impressed with it for that reason. Also, when you're wrenching on vehicles, this is a great set because it has a lot of serration and you can actually hold on to stuff. Watch my video about my tools of preference and you'll see why I like these so much. Alright, and now that is it. Our Rustler is pretty well ready to go. I'm going to put a Dean's connector on this to run LiPo batteries, and I will show that in another video at another time. This was just about the handling. So now you've seen what we do to this for handling. 30 weight shock fluid in the front, 32.5, just a tiny bit of rebound in the shock. Shock bottoms as far out on the arms as they will go. And then we have raised the rear links to the higher position, changed out the fluid in the rear end, and also changed out the spur and pinion gear in the rear end. So you have seen pretty well anything and everything that you can do to the rear end of a Slash. The only thing you have only seen on the front is the shocks, but again, there's not a ton of complexity in the front of the vehicle aside from just the arms, the links, the toe links, which are on the back side here that connect to the steering servo, and the steering servo itself underneath of this plate. So at another time we'll change out the steering servo and put in an aluminum bell crank, and I will show you how to do that as well. Thank you for watching this video. So I hope you learned something today and enjoyed this video and appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below and I will get to you as soon as I can on those. You can also email us at inthegrooverc21@gmail.com with those questions, and I will try to address them on here. Next Saturday, it is looking like the weather is going to be good. That's September 4th of 2021. We should be able to actually make it up to the race and do some interviews and talk to some local team drivers and pro drivers and be able to get you some awesome input from the track for outdoor 8-scale nitro and E, buggy and truggy, and maybe even some 4-wheel drive short course action as well. I'll have, like I said, you should have interviews, I'll have track shots, track video footage, and then I'm thinking that the week following that we may go ahead and do a live Q&A session if you guys would be interested in that. If you are interested in that, go ahead and comment that below as well. So we'll see you next time, and until then, make sure to keep the rubber side down, the shiny side up, and stay in the groove.